Okay, now I'll tell you my best holiday memory. It was not in Malaysia, in Kyoto, wherever. It was in Ireland in 1996, mid-August. I just arrived in Ireland. I rented a small cottage on the hills, and then I found out that I got hepatitis. So basically, my wife's holidays were fucked. And me, actually, I enjoyed it greatly. Not because of my wife's holidays, but I spent 2 weeks sitting in the sun, reading books, and having hell of a time, and not going to pubs, not getting drunk, and I read many books. And on that particular summer, the famous summer of '96, I came upon a book which I loved, which was it's a roman à clé, part a thriller, but also including a lot of thoughts on food, also including the idea of, and it's also a bit a kind of imaginary traveling, because it takes place in England, then in north of France, then in the south of France, and then it was structured following the rhythm of the 4 seasons, winter, spring, summer, autumn again, and then each big chapter was structured, was turning around a menu. So it was a novel that incorporated the idea of reflection on food. And I loved that book. And I started to follow, like a big fan, all the other works that the writer, the very distinguished writer, was doing. And so I read Mr. Phillips, I read Capitalism, and I even jumped on the first occasion to bring him in 2010 to a little trip to Lapland, where we had a lot of fun with some usual suspects like René, Chang, and other people. I really love his work. I really love his versatility. He's very versatile. He's doing lots of things at the same time and translating it. He has been also a food critic or a restaurant critic. We could decide what's the best title. He's on the board of the London Review of Books, and he's one of my favorite British writers. His name is John Lanchester. And he has another title that I like, which is Okay, and Now What? I think it's going to be deep and clever, and I only hope there will be some class notions on the, I don't know about this lecture, but it's on the idea or the end of the idea of luxury. Okay. Please welcome John Lanchester, and a huge welcome, please.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Andrea. I'd like to start by saying, on behalf of all the speakers, I'd like to say thank you to Andrea and Martin for all their heroic efforts in organising this. I mean, as you may know, the rules about COVID in Slovenia changed literally today, so it is a miracle that this event has happened for multiple reasons. So I'd like to say thank you to Andrea and thank you, Martin. So in response to the question, who's the most influential person in the contemporary world of food, Ferran Adrià once said, Chairman Mao. Typical Adrià answer, because it makes you go, what? But Adrià said that it was because it was Mao's Cultural Revolution that destroyed the tradition of classic cooking in China, and it was because the tradition of classic cooking in China was wiped out that Japan took the role of the most influential cooking style from the late 20th century onwards. Like lots of Adrià things, it's interesting, it's provocative, it's slightly mad. I don't agree with it. I think the most influential person in the contemporary world of food is still Auguste Escoffier, who's it's actually his 175th birthday. I'd like to pin that one on Andrea, but it's actually my mistake. Whose 175th birthday was last week. And I'd like you to think for a moment about what happens when you go to a restaurant. You go in, you're led to your table, you're presented a menu with a list of options for you to choose from, and then you have courses that are brought in sequence, and it's cooked by, as Maria was saying this morning, it's cooked by a brigade where there's a head chef and subordinate chefs who have responsibilities of clear chain of command, clear areas of demarcation. And all of those are things that Escoffier invented, those central norms that that they're so much, part of the way restaurants work. We don't even see them anymore. And to be clear, he didn't actually invent or create those things from scratch. What he did was he kind of codified them and made them into norms. And the reason that he was able to do that was because he was, from about the mid-1880s onwards, he was the most famous chef in the world. And at a point when you could actually, thanks to new changes in communication technology, print, cable, radio, etc., you could actually be world famous for the first time. And Escoffier was that person in the world of food, the first person to be genuinely global celebrity. And it was that gave him the power to effectively set these norms. Paul Bocuse once said, "Cooking is easy. All you have to do is be perfect and fast." And in a way, that comes out of Escoffier's idea of how a kitchen should work, function as a kind of machine. And as Maria said, there is a kind of dark masculinist side to that, because the brigade idea was actually based, it was copied directly from the army. But at the same time, Escoffier, one of his reasons for wanting order in the kitchen was because 19th century kitchens before him were incredibly chaotic, violent, disorderly, and also very, very hot. One of the things Escoffier did was work on trying to separate cooks, get them some distance from these unbelievably hot open fires. And one of the things that's been interesting today is hearing so much, movingly, particularly from Nikolai, I thought, about how that battle for welfare of kitchen and restaurant staff is still very much with us. Escoffier was fighting it in the 1880s and we're still fighting it today. But it's another area of his work that I mainly want to talk about, and that I think is most relevant to the pandemic moment. And as long as the fundamental is a la carte, service in courses, brigades, all that, Escoffier's other great invention was around the idea of luxury. And it came about through work with his business partner, César Ritz. They started working together in the 1880s in the Grand Hotel in Monte Carlo, which is a great destination place for wintering aristocrats. The south of France was a winter destination at that point. And then they were approached to open a new hotel in London, the Savoy. And at that point, 1890, you had the most famous cook in the world, the most famous hotelier in the world, and what was then the richest city in the world. It was a kind of super group, and that's the point at which they all became proper global celebrities and set all these new norms, new standards, and new ways of thinking, particularly around this idea that César Ritz had about luxury. And he said that the idea of luxury in hotels was to teach rich people how to live. That idea was connected to, I think it's a strange and rather humane idea. And what Ritz had noticed was that this was about a century and a bit ago, was a period of sharply increased economic inequality. It was the last time the world was as unequal as it is today, oddly enough. And on that subject, by the way, the current moment is very odd because countries are becoming closer together economically, but more divided inside themselves. You have a very strange period in world history in which economies are converging in terms of their wealth, but societies are growing wider. It's very strange. And one of the main exceptions to that is measured through something called the Gini coefficient, named after Corrado Gini, an Italian economist, who came up with this way of measuring inequality. And a Gini index of 1 means that all the income in a country belongs to one person. That's a society that's perfectly unequal. And the opposite end of the spectrum is a Gini coefficient of 0, in which everyone earns the same amount. So Gini index, lower is better. Anyone know what the World Bank says has the lowest Gini index in the world? No. Slovenia. So Slovenia has a claim to be, by an objective measure, the best country in the world. Just saying. So what Ritz had noticed around the turn of the last century was that you had this new generation of ultra-rich who weren't anchored to traditional markers of class and aristocracy. They had tons of money, but they didn't have ancestral estates, they didn't have ancestral castles, they didn't have a sort of inherited template for how to live. And his idea was to give it to them, to show them how they should live. And he created these hotels that were, you had this sort of new clientele, international super rich, you had the local aristocrats, you had theatre stars, opera stars, you had the local, well-off upper middle class people who wanted to see what the fuss was all about. And then you had what Escoffier's wife described as exiled princes pining for lost splendours. And you had this new kind of cocktail of clientele. And the thing that Ritz figured out was that rich people don't quite know what to do with themselves. Ritz and Escoffier figured out, they saw that rich people know they're supposed to be happy because they're rich, but they also know that they kind of aren't. And they live with this perpetual sort of low-grade anxiety. And that's where the idea, well, we'll show you how to live, we'll show you how to spend your money. And that's where that notion came from. But it turns out there's a problem with that. It's a problem rooted in human psychology. Because what people most want to do when they become rich, it turns out, is to make it clear to everyone else that they are rich. That's the single most important thing. The person who described this, who perceived it and described this, was a great Norwegian-American sociologist called Thorstein Veblen. And he invented the idea of something called the leisure class. And he noticed that aristocrats, so a couple of hundred years ago, aristocrats, their kind of central preoccupation was in showing that they were aristocrats, showing that they didn't have to work. So working people wore practical clothing and were suntanned from being outdoors. They wore incredibly elaborate costumes that prevented you from doing anything and had corpse-like pallor. And that was in order to send signals that they didn't have to work. I think suntans are quite interesting because they flipped, because then being able to go on holiday became a sign of being rich. So the rich became suntanned. And then everyone could afford to go on holiday, so the rich decided to be pale again. And that's basically where they are now. It's a bit like with suits. Suits were once a complicated, elaborate thing, then they became kind of formal business wear. Then now they're a kind of sign of office drudgery, that you're a 9-to-5 working stiff. And so when the richest people in the world, when Zuckerberg and Musk and Bezos and all that, well, the only time you ever see them in a suit is when they're testifying before Congress. So that's what luxury now is. It's a way of sending signs about how rich you are. The point of a ridiculously expensive handbag, say, it's not that it's in any way functionally superior to a handbag that costs, 1,000th as much. It's precisely the ridiculous expense which is the point. The point is that most people can't afford it. And the name of things like that are called Veblen goods, named after Veblen. And they have a unique characteristic in economics. Most things in economics, the supply and demand are mediated by price. So the price goes up, demand goes down, it stabilizes. Demand goes up, price goes up, people can't afford it, so demand comes down again. And that's the normal way things work. But with Veblen goods, the appetite for them increases as the price goes up. So the more expensive they are, the more people want them, because the whole point of them is that most people can't afford them. So when the price goes up, they actually deliver more utility for the customer. So a thing like a Supreme t-shirt, which costs, whatever it is, a couple of €1,000, exactly the same as a normal t-shirt. But the point of it is that we can't afford it. It's like a way of saying, I'm richer than you, fuck off. So the relevance for this, for restaurants and hospitality today, is that some restaurants, well, there's a risk of being caught in a kind of Veblen trap. So what is luxury today? You can see it in restaurants whose identity has become exclusive, linked to the production of particular signifiers. There's a question of ingredients Anna Ross was talking about earlier. There's this hierarchy of ingredients in which certain foods, not how it's cooked, not how it's executed, but just the ingredient in itself, have a kind of status of signifying luxury. Things like lobster and langoustine and foie gras. The other day I spent a few minutes flicking through the French Michelin. And they have, when a restaurant has a star, they list the specialité. You can look and see what they are. And I spent 5 to 10 minutes trying to find a single one whose specialité didn't include at least one of the traditional luxury ingredients: lobster, langoustine, foie gras. I couldn't do it. And lobster, langoustine, foie gras everywhere the eye could see. So the peak of gastronomic excellence is determined by things that seemed interesting to rich people about a century ago. It's incredibly boring. Consider a restaurant opened in New York a few years ago. 3 Michelin stars linked somewhere in Paris. And they were very proud of the specially commissioned velvet they had for the special stool that was by the side of female customers' chairs for them to put their handbags on. They'd commissioned a special velvet. They'd commissioned a special marquetry box for when it was time to pay the bill, ask for the pen to sign it. A special marquetry box that when you opened it gave the customer a selection of 12 different Mont Blanc pens. Now, there's absolutely no point at all in any of that. It's purely a sign of expense. It's purely a way of saying you're in the place that other people can't afford to be. It's Veblen goods at their most stark. And I think there's a risk of food at the top end getting caught in a kind of Michelin 50 best death spiral in which tasting menus get more and more expensive and complicated, and the main audience for the world's best chefs, the main audience for the best people at this thing we're all interested in, is bored rich people who are only there because it's the place where you can go to show that you're able to afford it. It's the place where you get the best signifiers of how rich you are because it's impossible to get to. And everywhere, there's also, like cities around the world, there's a kind of list of the place you have to go to. And the thing about those lists is that they're full of the kind of people who go to them to show that they're the kind of people who go to places on the list. That's what I mean by a death spiral. So I think the risk for everyone with an interest in gastronomy, all of us, and in food and culture, and in the area where food and culture overlap, is that things get stuck there. Well, so now what? The question is, has the invention of the high-end fine dining restaurant, Escoffier's idea of a restaurant that shows you how to live, become obsolete? Are we stuck in a world in which Veblen goods are the whole story, and the deepest meaning of restaurants is to get on some list, which means that most people won't be able to go there? Well, I hope not. I hope that the aftermath of the pandemic will offer us a chance to reset. Because when things have been at their darkest during these last 20 months, I think we've been forced into a new idea about what we value most. The most luxurious and important things have been things like just the first time you could get out of your house, first time you saw a friend, first time you had a conversation with someone you bumped into in the street, even when it was illegal, which for many countries, including my own, it was for a long time. I think those experiences we've learnt have become so charged, so important. Those basic fundamental things are the most intense, precious, luxurious experiences you can possibly have. I mean, in the area of food, for me personally, I've got this theory that the two things that are always better, that always taste better when they're made by someone else, are salad dressing and coffee. I don't know why that is, but it just is the case that other people's taste better. And I can vividly remember the first time I had a coffee not at home. UK lockdown in March, came out of lockdown in July, and then went round the corner to a local independent coffee shop. Being a typical London July, it was raining. I was outside in the pouring rain with espresso in a paper cup. And unquestionably, I can promise that's the best coffee I've ever had in my life, and I'll never forget it. I could say something similar about being here. We've all eaten amazing food and drunk fascinating wine and had interesting encounters, but I'd be lying if I didn't say the greatest luxury of being here has just been the thing about being here. Just being in Slovenia, just being somewhere else. That's an incredibly precious luxury that I think in some ways we were at risk of forgetting. Just the thrill of otherness, of other places in the world that you can go and see. The pandemic has taken so much from us. Sometimes when you see someone you haven't seen for a bit, you see it in their face. And you realise, well, if I can see it in their face, they can see it in mine, what we've all lost. So I think it's really important that we take what we can as a thing to learn. And for me, a big part of that learning is about simplicity, about how much the most important things are the smallest. And often they boil down to a sense of space, a sense that you have your freedom, that you're at your ease, that we can all just finally exhale, breathe out. In this context, the importance of food and hospitality, it seems to me, is as the experience of a gift. Of course, money changes hands. We get that. We're not children. But the economic transaction is not the heart of the exchange. The heart of the exchange is a gift, a moment of engagement between the customer and the waitstaff and the cook. It's personal. And in our recent and our current enforced disconnection from each other, we miss that opportunity to give and receive and experience that connection, experience that exchange of gift, which is at the heart of food and hospitality. And it's the thing that makes it more than a business, more than just a parade of signifiers. It's about connection and giving. This, I hope, is the post-pandemic direction for food and restaurants. And that, I think, is what Auguste Escoffier would say if he was here on the occasion of his 155th birthday. He'd say, remember that first moment when you get your freedom back, and that sense of space and ease and freedom and openness and safety and being able to just breathe out. Remember that feeling and try and give people that in the room and on the plate. Thank you.